Learn to read difficult SAT fiction passages like a pro. I'm going to give you 3 steps with which you can approach very old, seemingly ancient fiction passages. These 3 steps will alleviate your anxiety, improve your concentration, and raise your score. If you follow these 3 steps, these passages will go from dreaded to manageable, from debilitating to I can do this. The steps are straightforward and easy to remember. If you do these 3 steps when you see difficult SAT fiction passages, you'll read these passages like an expert. Are you ready? Here we go. Step 1, feel frustrated because it's normal. No one finds these passages easy. Nobody. Even PhDs in English literature don't come home and say, you know what? I'm in the mood for some light reading. Shakespeare sounds great. No, everyone struggles with this literature. Everyone. I'm on the content team here at Test Innovators, which means I wrote some of the questions that you see on our platform. I can't effortlessly read these difficult passages. If you're watching this video, that means I haven't been fired for making this admission. You know why? Because other people on the team also struggle with them. Surprised? Don't be. These passages are hard. Your frustration is legitimate. Your feelings are normal. You are not unintelligent. This is hard for everyone. This is difficult because these passages use different words than we do. Here are some of the words that were common hundreds of years ago, but are no longer used today. Words like knittering, hellkite, hagride, mickle, lickspittle, methinks, daggled. If a friend of yours walked up to you and said, methinks that knittering lickspittle hagrode me, so I daggle that nickel malkite, you wouldn't recognize that they were speaking English. These are words that we no longer use. And you know what? If someone from 100 years ago traveled into our time, they'd probably have a difficult time understanding what we were talking about. I don't buy that dude had a crush on her when he asked her out, because he told her right away they were going to go Dutch. I know he did that because he's probably not trying to be a simp, but I don't know, man. Kind of sus to me. To a person in Victorian England, that would sound very strange. And you know what? People 100 years from now will probably find this language as difficult as we find language from 100 years ago. So again, the first step to reading these difficult passages is to recognize that they are difficult, they are frustrating, and that's normal. I recommend taking 10 to 15 seconds to just be mad at them. Literally, be mad for 10 seconds, vent a little bit, get it out of your system, and then move on to step 2. Step 2, focus on what you know, not on what you don't. You're probably wondering, well, how do experts read these texts if these texts are so hard? Well, experts look at the words they know to understand the overall message of the text. They don't focus on the words that they don't know. There's not going to be a passage on the SAT where you don't understand a single word. There just won't be. That won't happen. So focus on the words that you understand and use them to answer the questions that the SAT asks you. If that doesn't work, move on to step 3. Figure it out later if it still doesn't make sense. Rarely do experts understand unfamiliar text with one read-through. It takes several times to get the message. And if they've read a passage several times and they still don't understand it, experts leave it aside for a little bit. Come back to it later. And you should do that too on the SAT. If you've tried working through a passage several times and you still can't understand what it says, skip it. Come back to it later. Your brain is going to subconsciously work on it as you focus on the other text. And when you come back to it later, you may have a new perspective. If you run out of time, I need to guess, at least you're going to guess on the difficult passage and not on the easy one at the end that you just didn't get to because you ran out of time. So again, 3 steps in order. Step 1, feel frustrated because it's normal. Step 2, focus on what you know, not on what you don't. Step 3, figure it out later if it still doesn't make sense. Let's see how these 3 steps work in practice. The following text is adapted from Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye. Something, indeed, which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after dinner face, but more often and loudly the acts of his life. Okay. Lots of unfamiliar, awkward words here. But we don't want to focus on unfamiliar, awkward words. We just want to focus on what we know. Well, we know what a lawyer is. So we know what his profession, his work is. Man. So this is an adult male. Rugged. Sounds kind of rough. So a lawyer, a man, kind of rough. Never lighted by a smile. Well, we know what a smile is. Never lighted by a smile. That probably means that he almost never smiled. Cold, scanty, embarrassed in discourse. Discourse means conversation. You know what embarrassed means? Someone who's cold, probably emotionless. What about scanty? What does scanty mean? I can honestly tell you that I don't know. And I deliberately did not look up the definition of scanty before recording this video because I wanted to show you how we can figure out the meaning of a text just by looking at the words that we know. We're not going to worry about scanty. We're not going to worry about countenance. We're just going to look at the words that we do understand. Rugged man, rough man, doesn't smile a whole lot, not a whole lot of emotions, embarrassed in discourse, maybe a little socially awkward. Next, backward in sentiment. I'm not really sure what that means. Let's skip it over. Lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. Lean. Sounds like he was probably a little bit fit. Dusty, dreary. That's probably connected to what we've already talked about before. Just not a whole lot of emotion in this person, yet somehow lovable. Lovable. Well, we know what lovable means. So the text says, although this is a person who is kind of rough, doesn't show a lot of emotion, almost never smiles, still is somehow lovable. Interesting. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, so sometimes he drank wine, went to friendly meetings. Next, something eminently human beaconed from his eye. Okay, interesting. So at friendly meetings, when he has a cup of wine, something human beacons from his eye. Something human comes out of his eyes. So although he's not showing a whole lot of emotion, his eyes are conveying something human, the text tells us. Interesting. Next, something indeed which never found its way into his talk. Interesting. It never found its way into his talk. So his eyes are conveying something that he's not communicating with his words. Interesting. So again, what do we know so far? This is a rough man, a lawyer, doesn't share a whole lot of emotions, almost never smiles, but the text says lovable. And he communicates certain emotions with his eyes. Next, but which spoke not only in the silent symbols of the after dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. Okay, well, if I just looked at these phrases below out of context, I probably not understand what they're saying. But based on what we've already talked about, which refers to something human, spoke not only in silent symbols of the after dinner face. So what could the silent symbols of the after dinner face be? Well, that's probably talking about him communicating things with his eyes and not his talk. He's communicating things silently with his face. So this is just elaborating on what we've learned already. And the final sentence says, more often and loudly in the acts of his life. Well, we know the saying, actions speak louder than words. So for this person, again, rough, doesn't smile a whole lot, kind of emotionally reserved, but still lovable, still goes to friendly meetings, and at those friendly meetings with a few glasses of wine, he does communicate something warm with his eyes, with the look on his face. And the text says more loudly in the acts of life. That's probably why he's lovable. Because although he seems like kind of an Eeyore, the text indicates he's a kind person, probably helps others, and people like having him around. Okay, let me remove our annotations and let's take a look at the questions. According to the text, what is true about Mr. Utterson? So, 3 of these options are going to be false, and 1 of these options is going to be true. Let's take a look at choice A. Choice A. He struggles to connect with others due to the fact he never smiles and is awkward in conversations. Well, the second half of this answer choice is true. Mr. Utterson never smiles. See that in the text? He's awkward in conversations. See that in the text as well, embarrassed in discourse, but struggles to connect with others. Actually, we see the opposite of that. Text says other people find him lovable. The text says Mr. Utterson attends friendly meetings, and when he has a glass of wine, he really loosens up a little bit. The text says at these gatherings with friends, something human beacons from his eyes. And although he doesn't talk a whole lot, he does speak through the acts of his life, through his actions. So all of this shows us that he doesn't struggle to connect with others. In fact, he connects with others quite well, even though he doesn't really smile, even though he's kind of cold, even though he's emotionally reserved most of the time. That said, he does loosen up in some situations. So we can't say that he struggles to connect with others, even though he does never smile, even though he is a little bit awkward. We can eliminate choice A. Choice B. When he feels comfortable enough around people, Mr. Utterson will let them know how he feels about them. Well, in the second half of the text, we read about situations where Mr. Utterson gets comfortable. At meetings with friends, he's had a glass of wine, he definitely relaxes. What about the second part? Mr. Utterson will let them, meaning people, know how he feels about them. Do we see a discussion of Mr. Utterson communicating to other people how he feels about them? I am not so sure. We do see the text talking about something human coming out of his eyes, something human on his after dinner face, his face after having a meal, after he's had his glass of wine. We read that his actions do a lot of his talking, But where do we see other people involved? Where do we see Mr. Utterson telling other people how he feels about them? I don't see that. Again, we see situations where he gets comfortable, but does Mr. Utterson tell other people how he feels about them in particular? Choice B is awfully specific. And I'm not sure we have enough evidence for choice B. But let's leave it alone for now. We'll come back to it later. Let's move on to choice C. Choice C. Despite Mr. Utterson's shortcomings, people still find him likable. Wow. Well, let's look at the text. The first half of the text talks about Mr. Utterson's shortcomings. We know what they are. He's kind of rough. He's emotionally reserved. Doesn't really smile a whole lot. A little socially awkward, embarrassed in discourse. Do people still find him likable? Yes, they do. Look at this. The text says, yet he was still somehow lovable. The second half kind of elaborates on why. He gets comfortable around friendly people in friendly meetings. He gets a little more relaxed after he's had a glass of wine. Something human is beacon from his eyes. He still doesn't do a whole lot of talking, but it's strongly implied that after he's had a meal, his after dinner face is a lot more relaxed than his before dinner face. And again, the text says he does most of his talking in the actions of his life. So the first half talks about shortcomings. The second half elaborates on why people still find him lovable. So a lot of evidence for choice C. Let's not select it yet. Let's also take a look at choice D. Mr. Utterson rarely feels the need to be social, as he prefers his own company. Well, do we see evidence that he prefers his own company? I mean, again, in the second half of the text, we read about social gatherings, where Mr. Utterson gets comfortable, where he communicates with friends. We read that Mr. Utterson is a lovable person, and it's implied that it's due to what happens in these social meetings and in his acts of service, probably helping other people. We don't have a whole lot of context, but we can speculate a little bit. And do we see a discussion that this rarely happens, that he rarely feels the need to be social? We don't. I mean, the text doesn't talk about how often he goes to friendly meetings, but again, it does call him lovable. So it's kind of implied that this happens more often than not. We do know he's a little bit emotionally reserved, but does that tell us he rarely goes to friendly meetings, has glasses of wine, talks with friends? He rarely performs these acts of his life, probably acts of service that make him lovable. Text doesn't say. In fact, I think the text strongly indicates that this is not all that rare. The text indicates that Mr. Utterson is not someone who necessarily prefers his own company, even though he does have a bit of a difficult time talking about his emotions. His talking is done in different ways, more loudly in his actions. But that doesn't tell us he prefers his own company. That doesn't tell us that he rarely goes out and is social. Kind of indicates the opposite of that. So we can eliminate choice D. So we are left with choices B and C. We talked about the shortcomings of B. We don't see Mr. Utterson talking to other people how he feels about them. Very, very specific. We see Mr. Utterson communicating some sort of emotions. We see him getting comfortable. We see a discussion that he communicates more with actions than words, but telling other people how he feels about them, ah, not a whole lot of evidence for choice B. On the contrary, choice C does have a lot of evidence, like we talked about. The first half discusses his shortcomings, and the second half discusses how people find him likable and kind of gives some clues as to why people find him likable despite his shortcomings. For those reasons, we can eliminate choice B and select choice C as our answer. So, one more time, 3 steps that you should take when you encounter difficult fiction SAT passages. Number 1, feel frustrated because it's normal. Number 2, focus on what you know, not on what you don't. Number 3, figure it out later if it still doesn't make sense. That last one is important. If you've worked through a passage for several minutes and you still can't figure it out, move on. Come back to it later. The worst thing that could happen is that you'll end up guessing. If you take these steps when you encounter difficult fiction passages, you will read them like an expert. Now, there are 2 other things that pros do that you can't do on the SAT, but you can do as you prepare for it. Number 1, study vocabulary. Experts read difficult passages with a dictionary in hand. When they see an unfamiliar word, they look it up, they write it down, and then they learn it over the next several days. Obviously, you can't use a dictionary on the SAT, but as you prep, write down vocabulary. The more words you know, the easier it'll be to understand difficult passages. If you're sitting in class, watching a lecture, talking with friends, browsing social media, watching TV or movies, any place where you see a difficult word, write it down, learn it, add to your vocabulary as you prepare for the SAT. The other thing that experts do is they practice a lot. Now, a PhD in English literature will never find unfamiliar Shakespearean English a breeze to read, but they will find it easier to read than a high schooler would find it easier to read because a PhD in English literature has read a lot more Shakespearean English than an average high schooler has. So practice a lot. Read a lot of different passages as you prepare for the SAT. A great way for you to do that is on our platform at testinnovators.com. We have 10 full-length practice tests designed exactly like the real SAT. We also have thousands of practice questions, and we have plenty of difficult fiction passages for you to practice with. In fact, the passage that we looked at today came from our free sample test that you can find on testinnovators.com/SAT. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to like it and subscribe to our channel for more helpful and free SAT content.